This is to help you get through part 4 of the Africans in America assignment. This part is called Judgment Day, and you can see that you were asked to read the introduction and an article called Fugitive Slaves and Northern Racism. So the introduction I have on the screen on the left side here, I'm going to read through that, and we should be able to find the answers to numbers 13 and 14. What controversy did Western expansion create in America? And number 14, what was the abolitionist movement? As westward expansion took hold, the question of whether the United States would be a pro-slavery or anti-slavery nation took on new importance. So that's basically your answer to number 13. In the North, anti-slavery forces included abolitionists who wanted a future without slavery so that Black people could be free, and free soil advocates who resented having to compete with owners of slave-tended plantations for use of new lands. So that helps you answer number 14. White Southern planters wanted a future for themselves and their prosperous way of life, which depended on the institution of slavery. As the New York Tribune announced, "We are two peoples. We are a people for freedom and a people for slavery. Between the two, conflict is inevitable." Rising conflict led to civil war in 1861, and the country was torn asunder. After 4 years and the loss of 617,000 American lives, the Union was saved, African Americans were promised the rights of citizens, and slavery was abolished. That's just a little bit of a preview for you because we're not learning about the Civil War quite yet. All right, I'm going to go to fugitive slaves and Northern racism. Now I should be able to find the answers to numbers 15 and 16 in this part. Number 15 says, who was Frederick Douglass? Open link. And number 16 says, describe the challenges faced by free Blacks in the North. Harriet Jacobs endured 7 years of hiding in an attic crawl space in order to escape the terror and misery of her life as a slave. I lived in that little dismal hole, almost deprived of light and air, and with no space to move my limbs for nearly 7 years. Yet I would have chosen this rather than my lot as a slave. Jacobs chose her prison rather than continue living in fear of her master's repeated sexual threats. She needed to escape, but she dared not leave her children. Through a peephole, she watched her children growing up. In 1842, friends helped her escape to Philadelphia, where her daughter had already been taken. Jacobs later wrote Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl under a pseudonym. When her memoir was published, its graphic description of abuse of slave women was unique among slave narratives and was shocking to American readers. For many fugitive slaves, the perils of escape were increased by the uncertainty of what life held for them in the free states should they succeed. The Underground Railroad was a support network providing assistance to runaway slaves. Fugitives were led by conductors along the path north to stations where they could eat and rest out of sight during the day. Harriet Tubman, who had escaped slavery at age 29, returned to the South 19 times to lead other slaves to freedom. Some fugitive slaves risked recapture by telling their stories. When Frederick Douglass published his autobiography in 1845, it became an international bestseller. Other slave narratives, such as Josiah Henson's, sold thousands of copies as well. These personal descriptions of life under slavery made it impossible for the injustice of slavery to be ignored and allowed the writers to publicly confront their former masters in writing. The message of the slave narratives was furthered enormously by the immense popularity of Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, with 300,000 copies printed in 1852 alone. It says that we need to open the Frederick Douglass link, so I'm going to do that. And that's a picture of him there. Frederick Douglass stood at the podium trembling with nervousness. Before him sat abolitionists who had traveled to the Massachusetts island of Nantucket. Only 23 years old at the time, Douglass overcame his nervousness and gave a stirring, eloquent speech about his life as a slave. Douglass would continue to give speeches for the rest of his life and would become a leading spokesperson for the abolition of slavery and for racial equality. The son of a slave woman and an unknown white man, Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was born in February of 1818 on Maryland's eastern shore. He spent his early years with his grandparents and with an aunt, seeing his mother only 4 or 5 times before her death when he was 7. All Douglass knew of his father was that he was white. During this time, he was exposed to the degradations of slavery, witnessing firsthand brutal whippings and spending much time cold and hungry. When he was 8, he was sent to Baltimore to live with a ship carpenter named Hugh Auld. There he learned to read and first heard the words abolition and abolitionists. Going to live at Baltimore, Douglass would later say, laid the foundation and opened the gateway to all my subsequent prosperity. Douglass spent 7 relatively comfortable years in Baltimore before being sent back to the country, where he was hired out to a farm run by a notoriously brutal slave breaker named Edward Covey. And the treatment he received was indeed brutal. Whipped daily and barely fed, Douglass was broken in body, soul, and spirit. On January 1st, 1836, Douglass made a resolution that he would be free by the end of the year. He planned an escape, but early in April he was jailed after his plan was discovered. 2 years later, while living in Baltimore and working at a shipyard, Douglass would finally realize his dream. He fled the city on September 3rd, 1838. Traveling by train, then steamboat, then train, he arrived in New York City the following day. Several weeks later, he had settled in New Bedford, Massachusetts, living with his newlywed bride, whom he met in Baltimore and married in New York, under his new name, Frederick Douglass. Always striving to educate himself, Douglass continued his reading. He joined various organizations in New Bedford, including a black church. He attended abolitionists' meetings. He subscribed to William Lloyd Garrison's weekly journal, The Liberator. In 1841, he saw Garrison speak at the Bristol Anti-Slavery Society's annual meeting. Douglass was inspired by the speaker, later stating, "No face and form ever impressed me with such sentiments as did those of William Lloyd Garrison." Garrison, too, was impressed with Douglass, mentioning him in The Liberator. Several days later, Douglass gave his speech at the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society's annual convention in Nantucket. The speech described at the top of this page. Of the speech, one correspondent reported, "Flinty hearts were pierced and cold ones melted by his eloquence." Before leaving the island, Douglass was asked to become a lecturer for the society for 3 years. It was the launch of a career that would continue throughout Douglass's long life. Despite apprehensions that the information might endanger his freedom, Douglass published his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. The year was 1845. 3 years later, after a speaking tour of England, Ireland, and Scotland, Douglass published the first issue of the North Star, a 4-page weekly out of Rochester, New York. Ever since he first met Garrison in 1841, the white abolitionist leader had been Douglass's mentor, but the views of Garrison and Douglass ultimately diverged. Garrison represented the radical end of the abolitionist spectrum. He denounced churches, political parties, even voting. He believed in the dissolution of the Union. He also believed that the U.S. Constitution was a pro-slavery document. After his tour of Europe and the establishment of his paper, Douglass's views began to change. He was becoming more of an independent thinker, more pragmatic. In 1851, Douglass announced at a meeting in Syracuse, New York, that he did not assume the Constitution was a pro-slavery document and that it could even be wielded in behalf of emancipation, especially where the federal government had exclusive jurisdiction. Douglass also did not advocate the dissolution of the Union since it would isolate slaves in the South. This led to a bitter dispute between Garrison and Douglass that, despite the efforts of others, such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, to reconcile the two, would last into the Civil War. Frederick Douglass would continue his active involvement to better the lives of African Americans. He conferred with Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War and recruited Northern blacks for the Union Army. After the war, he fought for the rights of women and African Americans alike. So definitely enough information to answer number 15, who was he? And I'm going to go back. Oh, I'm not sure if I went to the right place. I'm looking for fugitive slaves and Northern racism. Let me go back to that and keep reading past Frederick Douglass to get the answer to number 16. Describe the challenges faced by free blacks in the North. When California, one of the territories gained by the U.S. in the Mexican War, petitioned to become a state, the controversy over whether slavery should exist in these new territories of the Southwest led to the Compromise of 1850. After a heated debate in Congress, it was decided that California would be a free state, but in return, slaveholders were promised a much more stringent Fugitive Slave Act. Under this law, any bystander, white or black, could be forced to assist in the capture of a fugitive slave. Special commissioners were awarded $10 for each fugitive returned to slavery and only $5 for those who were acquitted. Blacks who had been living in freedom for years were hunted down by slaveholders armed with the new law. The recapture in 1854 of Anthony Burns, who had fled from Virginia to the great abolitionist headquarters of Boston, brought the controversy over the new law to a head. Hundreds of black and white abolitionists gathered while several stormed the courthouse to set Burns free. U.S. Marines and artillery were sent in to quell the uprising, which swelled to thousands in the days that followed. Burns was convicted and returned to Virginia amid terrible protests. In the following year, money was raised to buy his freedom. Anthony Burns had a galvanizing effect on Northerners. Despite the actions of abolitionists, life for free blacks was far from idyllic due to Northern racism. Most free blacks lived in racial enclaves in major cities of the North: New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Cincinnati. There, poor living conditions led to disease and death. In a Philadelphia study in 1846, practically all poor black infants died shortly after birth. Even wealthy blacks were prohibited from living in white neighborhoods due to whites' fear of declining property values. African Americans were either refused admission to or segregated in hotels, restaurants, and theaters. Blacks had limited work and educational opportunities. They were often denied access to public transportation in cities and allowed on trains only in Jim Crow segregated cars. They were also denied civil rights, such as the right to vote and the right to testify in court in many states, thus leaving them open to attack by thieves and mobs and to be captured and sold by slave catchers. Black men and women were routinely attacked in the streets, and from 1820 to 1850, black churches, schools, and homes were looted and burned in riots in major cities throughout the North, forcing many blacks to flee to Canada. Northern blacks were forced to live in a white man's democracy and, while not legally enslaved, subject to definition by their race. In their all-black communities, they continued to build their own churches and schools and to develop vigilance committees to protect members of the black community from hostility and violence. That completes part 4. You should have enough information there to answer number 16.